So the topic is geopolitics and crypto, quite an amorphous and hairy one. We've got 20 minutes to try and cover it. I'm not sure we solve it in the time, but let's try and give it a go. So Sten, I'd love, I mean, many people in the audience probably know you well already, but I'd love for you to give an intro to your background in technology and your relationship and introduction to crypto as well.
Sure, I'm the guy between you and the cocktails. But besides that, I'm a lifelong software entrepreneur. I've been building companies since I was 18. The biggest story to date was Skype, where I was very, very early, which in the context of today's event, it wasn't an open protocol, but it was a peer-to-peer, highly encrypted, asynchronous and synchronous communication network, so some similarities there. I've been in cryptos for 9 years now, and the company that I most recently started before I became an investor with Plural Platform was called Teleport. And so that ties into this conversation today, because at Teleport we were building software for people on the move and building on the premise that every government is competing for every citizen. So this is where I believe that distributed systems, technology, people living increasingly online, and kind of the world where we are used to governance models that deal with our physical location, that they collide and combine in interesting ways. And I think that's Web3 is the enabling of that becoming even clearer.
Nice, and we'll definitely get onto that topic at some point. Perhaps to set the stage for everyone, though, I'd love for you to, with a geopolitical hat on, take us back through the last kind of 20 to 30 years of the history of technology and the internet. How would you characterize that from a geopolitical standpoint? And what are some of the risks that you see in the system today?
Yeah, so I think going all the way back, like internet and technology have very academic roots. Like the systems that we use today usually started in some lab, and I would argue that the academic roots of the internet were pretty evenly distributed between US, Europe, several centers in Asia, and so forth. But what you see today in Web 2, there are basically two dominant models. There is what most people who use English language products and live in the West tend to use is sort of the American model. It's the sort of a system where majority of technological consumer adoption is driven by 5, up until recently, trillion-dollar companies, the Googles and Apples and Facebooks. People living in North America especially, like they would rather have a Facebook account or a Google email address, but they don't trust their government to give them an ID. So it's very market-driven, very corporate-driven, very company-driven, and that has developed into sort of, when we use a cloud, it's owned by a company, typically publicly listed in the US, right? And on the other side, you have the Chinese model, which is basically this authoritarian communist model where the only person giving you any identity online is the government, and there is a layer of private companies, but behind them there's always these sort of ears of the government and the Communist Party. So who sees your data, who owns your data, who owns your health records, all of that in the US would be owned by a private company. In China it's owned by the government in one way or another. And I would argue that there is a blaring gap in between that historically we've filled. Like if you take, we're in Finland, like Linus Torvalds building Linux as an open source, free movement and operating system. There have been different ways of solving technological problems, but today they are not really visible. And interestingly, Europe is way less visible than it has been in some of these previous waves. So it's like this US-China models, gap in between. I think there is a role for Europe, and I think there's a role for Web3 and the open source user-owned model to sort of populate that.
Nice, and again, let's park that for a bit. In terms of the historical role of crypto in geopolitics, has crypto played any role at all so far, do you think? And how would you contrast that with sort of Western influence relative to, let's say, emerging market influence, for example?
I think the crypto and state have met in the most obvious and most superficial places at first. So, okay, there is something that looks like money. We have institutions that regulate money, ergo we should make these regulations work for this new kind of money, or in simplest terms, let's ban it. And that has worked on different micro levels, but hasn't really stopped the global development of decentralized technologies. If you look at end-user adoption, I think we're still living in a very sort of interesting phase where many technologists themselves live in well-developed Western markets, and kind of we're still like looking at Bitcoin and Ether and stablecoins. There's like interesting use cases there. But if you live in Vietnam or if you live in Argentina with 100% inflation, it's not like an abstract future technology. It's something that can preserve your life today. So Chain Analysis recently published you should look it up. It's an interesting report of actual real end-user adoption curves. And it's definitely developing market, the longer tail that is picking up first, and the places where you see most of the crypto companies, where most of our speakers are from today, are not the ones that are highest on adoption.
And when you spoke about the sort of bifurcation of the world, the Western model, some of these closed companies that we've seen, the Chinese model, which is more of a walled garden kind of entity. When you think about the future, how do you imagine crypto, Web3 might mitigate against some of these risks, solve some of these problems that you spoke about?
I think the highest level, like if you look at the macro picture, I think this week we're celebrating 8 billion people on the planet, or I don't know, celebrating, or what's the reaction to that? But there is, out of the 8 billion people, there is about 3.5 billion jobs, people in working age, and probably about 10-20% of them, probably like 500 million, 700 million people are working with information mostly. And why that shift has been extremely crucial is that if your work doesn't involve a physical location, if you're not moving bricks, if you're not building something physical in a given location, if you're a writer, a coder, a designer, a journalist, your output are bits rather than atoms, then all of a sudden your work is not attached to your location. Your income is not dependent on a location. And the way you make money, the way you sustain yourself, the way you fulfill yourself, and what is the environment where you want to live in become detached. So all of a sudden you're free to change the location, either physically or what you also see like jurisdictionally. Like you can live in Ukraine, despite of the war, you can have a legal entity in Estonia and sell something to a customer in Germany. And this model, this sort of locationless, free, open economic model is completely incompatible with the Westphalian system. Like in that example that I just gave, like which government should get taxes for what and when? And these are the sort of the problems that the governments are still sort of facing. There is one knee-jerk reaction is to ban things, and the other knee-jerk reaction is that, oh, this is interesting. This can be a competitive advantage. And so you immediately see like different governments having like very different takes. And as an Estonian, we've been spoiled with the sort of the most digital society on the planet, and we've opened it up with e-residency. There's stuff like that is happening there. But on a global scale, I think this competition is still only beginning. And I think the winners of that are the ones who, the way I think about it is like, what are the governments that figure out how to plug into the API of those modern technologies and be a good place for people building or running their lives and businesses on top of these technologies want to be.
And very practically, how do you imagine Web3 interacting with that level of sort of inter-country competition?
So one interesting thing I've seen recently in the last sort of 18, 24 months as an investor, there is a number of people building DAOs that try to do things in physical world. So for example, there is a DAO who is dealing with carbon credits on chain. They raise money, they actually have revenues, and their idea was that, okay, how do we buy sustainable energy assets in different countries? And so this is where Web3 sort of kind of falls down right now, that, okay, it's all fun and games, like stable coins turn into carbon credits, transactions happen, like automated market making happens, all of that, but all of a sudden you want to acquire a plot of land physically located in Germany that has a contract, has a company on it and a contract with the local energy provider. And that's like that interface, that API is the gap. Or there was another example where I got recently pitched by people who are building sort of a refi product related to real estate, and the structure they had figured out was a non-profit registered in Austria because there was some basic, very weird little nuance in the Austrian sort of law which made it easier to map the leading decisions of that legal entity to token holders and sort of the government's process. So there is like, people are trying to hack into this sort of old school legal systems, and that takes them to weird and wonderful locations around the world where they've sometimes never been physically, but they're building their structures around that. Imagine now there is a government or 10 who make it really easy. And that's like a $1 trillion opportunity in a decade.
And I think one of the other interesting topics around this competition point, I think, is around currency. I think one of the interesting things we saw with US dollar stablecoins is that for the first time ever, anyone in the world can hold, really very easily, dollars in their crypto wallet, for example. And this might lead to a point at which, in emerging markets, you might have the kind of increasing dollarization of those economies. Those sorts of currencies will need to compete with the dollar. How do you see that playing out? Do you see that as a risk? Do you see that as something which is a net positive for the way governments might manage their currencies to make them more effective, more stable, things like that?
Yeah, I think there's definitely like different waves of that. The obvious one is the stablecoins pegged to fiats, which is like, yes, I think the current stablecoin picture is heavily dominated by USD, and not only in developing markets, but also like I know a bunch of like software developers participating in DAOs, for example, from Europe, whose expenses are in euros, but the only way they can get paid is USDC, for example, or USDT, because that's what the DAO supports. And it's kind of like, people don't think about it that often, but I think there is like the asynchronicity of the local physical-based currency where you are and your income streams. Creates like this very weird like exchange risk and all of these things. Then again, so I think definitely there's massive room for euro-based stablecoins and sort of collateral stablecoins and more of that. That's another link to the sort of between the new and the old world. But beyond that, then it gets into a territory where like, okay, if trillions of dollars and euros are printed, like, do you want to tie anything to that, or what's the most stable thing, and real asset-based things? And I think the most fascinating thing that I think most governments haven't figured out is that by tokenizing everything, all of a sudden you don't need money for majority of transactions. Like today, if somebody buys Apple stock and then wants to go into Google stock, they go into dollar in between. But if there is a liquidity pool for both of the stocks, like why do you need dollars in between? And that's I think there is a lot of fun realizations for next 5 or 10 years for many people in government.
And is this still on? Hello.
Yep.
We spoke a bit, obviously, again about the US, China. Now, in the context of kind of Europe, geopolitics, and kind of Web3, what does Europe have to offer that is different? Do we have specialisms here? Do we have a philosophy, a third way that you think gives a sort of a new role for Europe in the context of Web3 and geopolitics?
Yeah, I think I'm extremely bullish in Europe. I've lived 10% of my life in the US and I'm back in Europe. And we at Plural, we're extremely bullish about Europe. And I think one way to think about it is there is a set of underlying, like leaving all the technology aside, like there is a set of underlying humanitarian values and principles that we have in Europe that are pretty unique for this continent, which I would argue are quite compatible with the vision and values of Web3. So if you think about like privacy and custody and regulations around that, like most of the world was quite annoyed about Europe introducing GDPR, but in reality that's kind of what it is. Like it's like the citizen principles, like the citizens owns the data. If you move data, health data through a health system, then it's the citizen who decides who sees that and who not, rather than a commercial entity running the hospital and whatnot. So there are these sort of basics, I think, that are there. The other thing I think is, early on when we were building Skype from Europe, there was a very, I think by the time 1 year in, probably we had the product available in like 12 languages. And then we were looking at our US competitors who had an English-only product with dollar signs hard-coded. It's kind of like when you come from a more diverse continent like Europe is, with different languages, different cultures, different currencies, like you kind of take it more naturally to build for a more diverse world. And that's something, again, like if Web3 is sort of a community-owned and builder-owned system, like you cannot presume that they all speak one language, they all prefer to have one currency, and there's like a much more flexibility built into these things. And so that list can go on, but I think if you take that and now apply sort of this technological, Europe has hubs and knowledge about cryptography, peer-to-peer systems, how to build open source, like these elements are all there. So I think combining something like that, it's not like by the way, don't get me wrong, it's not about building a US island, Chinese island, like metaphorically, and the European island, but I think it's about the choice. Like there will be still people in Europe who will be using US corporate systems because they might have an amazing user experience. There are still people in Africa who are going to be using TikTok, even though it's a Chinese company and there is sort of privacy issues there. But like having that island or this option that is more based on European values and citizen ownership of data and privacy and self-custody and European values is something that will be attractive also for people from Asia and from America to use. So.
Really interesting. Do you see any, does Web3 pose any risks to geopolitical stability or tensions at all?
Of course it does. I mean, one reason, like every time I ask any European bankers, like, why don't we have digital euros yet, like on a level, it's like, imagine a bank run in a bad situation can happen in a second. I mean, this liquidity that we all cherish in this room, like for many more stability-oriented, more risk mitigation-related structures, feels really, really scary. And also, like the big struggle, which I think needs to be fought out in the years to come, again, where I know some European startups are doing a really good job, is that what does KYC look like in this? Like, there are places where you do need to know who you're dealing with. It doesn't mean, like, the most absurd thing of KYC is like getting a visual copy of somebody's passport. Like there are so many transactions where you don't need to name the name and the home address and birthday and the full photo and all these sort of things, but you would need to know that, for example, some other parties that you trust have seen that person. So what is a KYC model? What is the KYB model? Like one experiment that I've been pitching to the Estonian government is that anybody who is paying taxes in Estonia on crypto, if they're willing to give their wallet like to the tax board, the government should drop Estonian government has seen this wallet NFT. Like no PII, but any DeFi application can choose if they take it as an additional positive signal or they do something with this. So there is like this very simple things that are between this rigid current requirements and increasingly burdensome transactional requirements that are a reaction to real issues with money laundering and terrorism and all of that, but maybe Web3 would actually solve them better. So,
before we talk about sort of network state, sovereign individual, just a question on sort of price action. So a lot of the narrative around you know, assets being taken, hyperinflation, things like that, that's a geopolitical theme that should play well to the kind of crypto price action. And yet we've got this incredible kind of macro environment, obviously, with liquidity being taken out of the system, you know, QT, higher interest rates and things like that, sort of depressing prices at the moment. Do you see there being any point at which the sort of geopolitical narrative takes over, especially for things like Bitcoin and things like that, and it plays a stronger role in price action, or is the macro always going to kind of dominate this environment?
Frankly, I just don't know. It's like I've been surprised. 9 years ago, I was definitely expected that there's a quicker detachment between, let's say, S&P 500 and Bitcoin price. The fact that we're going through all this turbulence and the sort of correlation is still close to 1, like that's spooky. Like I don't know why that is. I hope that they will detach at some point, or logically they should. So, yeah, I don't have a strong view there.
Got about a minute and a half. You are obviously close to Balaji. He's, you know, one of your co-founders at Teleport. Can you talk a little bit about your thoughts on the sovereign individual, the network state, and give us a sense for what the sort of holy grail is here, the sort of digital Atlantis that we might be kind of building towards?
Yeah, so I think think Balaji Srinivasan was my co-founder at Teleport, one of the co-founders that we started with kind of simultaneously hanging out at the Stanford Bitcoin group and building Teleport as a company for this sort of class of people that we believe that is emerging, which is people who are more location independent and can work anywhere. So he's recently published a book called The Network State, which if you haven't read, I highly recommend it. It's a good summary of all this sort of decade of thinking. And I think there is, so what Balaji is saying is and in many other things, I think Balaji goes maybe more to the outskirts, to the sort of further frontier, and I'm more of a, more moderate in some of those topics. So for example, Balaji predicts that there will be a lot of state creation that actually happens, that these sort of virtual communities that form in the cloud, that they will materialize in physical space, which I do believe will happen. But I think there is a path also there where countries and nation states and countries and cities and territories will shift their rules in a way to become more network states instead of just clearly and bluntly creating new entities out of the get-go. And there is interesting thing that I've seen is that there is the units of management that matter are becoming smaller. So if you look at how the Catalans or the Scots in Europe think about themselves, if you talk to a young European, like, are they really moving to the US or they're moving to New York or Miami? Shanghai, what happens in Shanghai, what happens in Hong Kong is more interesting and important than what happens in China. And that creates a definite advantage of the countries that are smaller, because the power distance between making decisions about municipal matters and international relations matters is shorter. So that's why you see in crypto and Web3 Singapore like doing the most interesting things in Asia, because they have this mobility, they have this ability to be fast. That's why you have Iceland doing interesting things. That's why you have Estonia doing interesting things. And the good news is that on that scale, Finland is small enough, Sweden is small enough, Luxembourg is small enough. So things that can be solved on a city level will be, and things that can be only required to be a UN member to have a vote or whatever, then they would happen in smaller countries first, which I think will tip the power balance, because in this Web3 era, capital, people, ideas, like all of these things, if you create a great environment, they will come quicker than ever before. And if you fuck up your environment, they will leave faster than ever before.
Awesome.